The town of Pikeville in 1911 looked much like any other settlement tucked into the folds of Kentucky's eastern mountains. Narrow streets, rows of wooden storefronts, and a church steeple that seemed too tall for the modest lives it presided over. Yet beneath the familiar hum of wagons and the smell of coal dust drifting from the valley, there lingered a faint unease, whispered more than spoken, about the boy at the orphanage who would not speak. The orphanage itself sat on a low rise, its walls of weathered brick softened by ivy that clung as though to smother the silence inside. Those who worked there described the child with contradictions: polite but distant, obedient but detached, a figure who moved quietly through corridors yet left a heaviness in his wake. He had arrived in the spring when the river swelled and the hills were still cold with mist. No one knew from where. The papers that should have accompanied him were missing, and no family ever came forward. It was Reverend Caldwell, a man accustomed to certainties of Scripture, who first confessed to feeling unsettled. He told a physician friend, Dr. Samuel Harlow, that whenever he looked into the boy's eyes, he felt as if he were the one being judged. "He watches without blinking," the Reverend said, "as though my words are being weighed on a scale invisible to me." Harlow, a man of science, tried to dismiss this as projection born of grief and the many burdens an orphanage imposed. But when he finally visited, he too left with the sensation that the boy's silence was not mere muteness, but a refusal, an act of will. The other children whispered about him. Some said he never slept, that his bed remained cold in the night. Others claimed he walked the halls barefoot long after curfew, his steps so quiet they sounded more like memory than movement. The matron dismissed these tales as childish imagination, though her own hands trembled whenever she locked the doors. Then came the chalk. On a summer morning, one of the attendants found a message scrawled across the blackboard of the classroom. It was not a phrase that any of the children admitted to writing, and the handwriting was crude but deliberate. In white strokes against the dark slate were the words, "I am a stranger here." The discovery unsettled the orphanage staff. They questioned each child, but none confessed. Only one boy had chalk dust beneath his fingernails, and he sat in silence as they pressed him for answers, his gaze fixed on the floorboards as though something far beneath them held his attention. Dr. Harlow was called in again, and he observed the child with growing unease. The boy did not appear frightened or guilty, but composed, as if he had finally spoken the truth in the only way he allowed himself. Harlow recorded in his notebook, "There is no defect of the tongue. This is not silence born of inability. It is a decision, a declaration of some kind." The message on the board was erased by the matron before evening prayers, yet the words clung to those who had seen them. Some of the attendants whispered that the boy was not meant for Pikeville at all, that he had come from elsewhere, not another town, but somewhere unnamed, unreachable. That night, the chalk was found again. This time, the message was shorter and more chilling. It read, "Not yours." The two words remained etched in the minds of everyone inside the orphanage, more enduring than any chalk marks on a board. The matron swore she had locked the supply cupboard that held the chalk, and yet it appeared again, as though summoned rather than stolen. Some of the children began to refuse sleep in the dormitory, gathering instead in corners to whisper their fears, while the attendants patrolled the halls with lanterns, their nerves taut as wires stretched too thin. Dr. Harlow returned for the third time, his medical bag in hand, but his thoughts straying further into questions no stethoscope could answer. He stood in the classroom studying the board where the message had been found. He thought about the boy's silence, about the deliberate nature of written words appearing where none should, and the haunting clarity of a child's decision to communicate through absence rather than voice. It was not simply defiance. It was a declaration of separation, not yours, not belonging, not claimed, not of this place. The reverend attempted to interpret the phrase through scripture, warning the staff against imagining demons where none were. Yet his own sermons began to tremble with the weight of unsaid things, the congregation noting how often his eyes drifted toward the orphanage perched on the hill, as if its very bricks pressed on his conscience. One storm-filled night, when rain lashed against the windows and wind rattled the shutters, an attendant claimed to see the boy outside in the courtyard, though every door remained bolted from within. She described him standing motionless in the downpour, his head tilted back as if listening to something carried in the storm that none of them could hear. By the time the lanterns were lit and the courtyard checked, there was no sign of him. His bed, when examined, was dry and undisturbed, as though he had never left it. The incident divided the staff between those who dismissed the story as nerves and those who began to avoid the boy entirely, crossing themselves in his presence. Harlow's notes grew darker. He wrote of the orphan not as a patient, but as a phenomenon. Children adapt to survive, he reminded himself. Yet this child seemed not to adapt, but to resist the very fabric of where he had been placed. There was no longing for adoption, no hunger for acceptance, only the quiet insistence, not yours. When the chalk appeared once more, it was not on the board, but carved faintly into the wooden frame of the dormitory door, not etched with a knife, but pressed in chalk into the grooves, as though someone had carefully traced what was already there. Words revealed rather than written. The matron found it at dawn, her hands shaking as she summoned Harlow to see for himself. The doctor bent close, touching the grooves, feeling the old wood give slightly under his fingers. The chalk had not crumbled as expected, as though it had adhered more firmly than it should. He glanced back at the boy who sat on his cot, staring not at Harlow nor the matron, but at the faint light spilling through the window. And then, for the first time since his arrival, the boy turned his gaze directly to Harlow and smiled. It was not the smile of a child, no trace of mischief, no plea for approval. It was slow, deliberate, and unsettlingly calm, as though the boy were confirming something only he and Harlow understood. The doctor felt his own breath catch, an involuntary tightening in his chest, as if the boy had reached across the gulf of silence and laid bare the futility of every question that had been asked of him. The matron standing beside Harlow muttered a prayer under her breath. She could not describe what disturbed her more, the words that kept appearing in chalk or that smile which seemed less an expression than a verdict. In the days that followed, her health faltered. Her hands shook constantly and her voice cracked when she gave orders. The children began to mirror her unease, avoiding the boy's presence, sitting away from him at meals, leaving gaps on the benches as though his mere nearness carried contagion. Rumors escaped the orphanage walls and spread into town. Pikeville was small, and stories clung to its air like coal dust. Some whispered that the boy was cursed, that he had been abandoned by a mother who knew what he was. Others suggested he was not an orphan at all, but a runaway whose silence concealed crimes too heavy for a child to carry. Yet the most disturbing claim came from a farmer's wife who had once worked in the orphanage kitchen. She swore that when the boy passed her in the corridor, she heard words not with her ears but in her mind, an echo that did not belong to her own thoughts. Harlow did not repeat this to anyone, though he too began to dream uneasily. In one dream, he stood at the classroom blackboard, writing the phrase, "Not yours," again and again, only to turn and find the boy seated in every desk, rows of identical faces watching him with silent patience. He awoke with sweat staining his collar, his rational mind at war with the creeping suspicion that logic alone could not map this child. Then came the second message. This time it was written on the inside of Harlow's own notebook, in the margin between his clinical notes. The ink was his own, the handwriting unmistakably his. yet he did not remember writing it. The words were, "You know me." He stared at the page for a long time, hearing in his memory that smile, still, quiet, claiming recognition where none should exist. Harlow considered burning the notebook, but something stopped him. Instead, he carried it back to the orphanage and confronted the boy directly, notebook in hand. "Did you write this?" he asked, aware of the absurdity, aware of speaking aloud to a child who had never once given him a word. The boy's gaze lifted, meeting Harlow's steadily, and for a moment it seemed as if he might finally break the silence. His lips parted, but what emerged was not speech. It was a slow exhale, as though releasing a secret into the air, heavy enough to press against Harlow's very thoughts. And in that breath, Harlow swore he heard it, the faintest whisper inside his own skull. Yes, the sound or the thought was so fleeting that Harlow questioned his sanity. He closed the notebook with a snap, as if shutting the words away could restore order. Yet the boy kept staring, his expression unshaken, his silence suddenly more menacing because it seemed no longer passive. The child was not waiting for speech to return. He was withholding it, as a man withholds a weapon until the right moment. That realization gripped Harlow with a chill, unlike any winter's draft. It meant intent. It meant choice. He had spent his career among the sick and the lost, but never had he encountered silence that felt designed. From that day forward, he began to watch the boy not with the eyes of a doctor, but with those of an investigator, charting every glance, every twitch of a hand, each calculated pause. And the more he recorded, the more he felt as if the boy anticipated his notes, shaping them before Harlow's pen met the paper. Meanwhile, the orphanage strained under invisible weight. 2 attendants resigned within a week, one citing illness, the other refusing to give reason at all. The remaining staff walked with subdued steps, their voices hushed as though raising them might provoke something best. Left undisturbed, the children no longer played freely. They avoided the yard and clung to one another at mealtimes, always keeping their distance from the boy. He remained apart, never reaching for companionship, and yet the air around him bent the room to his presence. One evening, the Reverend returned, urged by whispers that the boy's influence was poisoning the entire house. He carried his Bible as though it were armor, and he demanded to speak with the child alone. Harlow, against his better judgment, allowed it. Through the keyhole, he watched the meeting, the Reverend reading aloud passages meant to reassure, his voice filling the dormitory until he faltered. For the boy was watching him with such unbroken focus that the Reverend's words tangled and died. Sweat pooled at his brow. He closed the Bible mid-verse, muttered a prayer, and fled the room without daring to look back. Afterward, the boy lifted his gaze toward the keyhole. Harlow swore he knew he was there. It was not suspicion, it was certainty. That night, the doctor did not sleep. He sat at his desk, reviewing his notes by lamplight. The words, "Not yours and you know me," glaring from the pages as if written in fresh ink. He considered writing to colleagues in Lexington or Louisville. But what could he say? That a child's silence bore intent? That words appeared where they should not? That he himself had heard a whisper inside his own mind? By dawn, a decision crystallized. He would watch the boy more closely than ever before, with no pretense of treatment, only the cold scrutiny of one who seeks to understand a threat. But as he rose from his chair, he noticed something new on his desk. His lamp had guttered during the night, yet in the gray of morning he saw chalk dust smeared across the wood, faint lines spelling words that had not been there when he closed his eyes. They read, "You are mine." The words shimmered in Harlow's mind long after the chalk dust had been wiped from his desk. He tried to convince himself it was some cruel trick of one of the older children, a prank meant to unnerve the doctor who had made their lives stricter with his observations. But the handwriting again carried the strange precision of the earlier messages. Neither childish scrawl nor adult script, something suspended between deliberate and steady, as if carved by intent older than the boy who supposedly left it. Harlow carried the notebook and his recollections to the sheriff, thinking at last that he must place this outside the walls of the orphanage. Sheriff Linton, a stout man with coal-blackened nails and the blunt manner of one accustomed to drunken fights rather than mysteries, listened with furrowed brows. "Doctor," he said finally, "children don't haunt houses. They act out. You've been staring at him too long." The words stung, for Harlow knew there was truth in the accusation. He was staring too long, watching too closely, and yet he could not look away. The sheriff agreed reluctantly to visit, if only to quiet the rumors swirling through Pikeville. His arrival at the orphanage drew the children to the windows, eyes wide as they watched him stride through the yard. Harlow led him to the boy. The orphan sat at his usual place, unmoving, his gaze fixed on the wall as though the sheriff did not exist. "Speak up, son," the sheriff said, his voice softened, perhaps by pity. "They say you've been writing things. Go on now, say it." But the boy neither blinked nor stirred. Frustration colored the sheriff's cheeks. He left with a muttered curse, declaring the staff superstitious. Yet before the week's end, his wife reported him sleepless, plagued by strange dreams of children standing in the corners of their bedroom, silent, eyes wide. Within days, the sheriff stopped returning Harlow's letters. The pattern of events grew. Livestock in nearby farms startled and broke through fences in the night, eyes wild as though pursued by something unseen. 2 of the younger orphans fell ill with fevers, raving in their sleep about a boy standing over them, watching with eyes like glass. The matron called it coincidence, but her face betrayed fear. She began lighting candles outside the boy's door each night, a gesture more desperate than faithful. Harlow, caught between his oath to heal and his growing dread, studied patterns in his notes. He realized each appearance of the chalk messages coincided with moments of confrontation. The reverend's reading, the sheriff's questioning, Harlow's own suspicions pressed too far. The boy was not random. He responded carefully to intrusion. Every silence was an answer. Every word appeared when his stillness was most challenged. It dawned on Harlow then, the boy was not merely resisting integration. He was testing boundaries. The orphanage was not a shelter to him, but a stage. And each adult who dared to assert control became a subject of his quiet experiments. The realization sent a chill through Harlow's veins. This was no child lost to trauma. This was calculation. One night, unable to resist the pull of compulsion, Harlow sat alone in the classroom, chalk in hand. He wrote on the board, "Who are you?" The room was empty, the air was still. He set the chalk down and turned to leave. When he looked back, the words had changed. They now read, "You already know." The chalk strokes on the board seemed to glimmer in the lantern light, as if the message itself breathed. Harlow's hand trembled against the frame of the door. He wanted to deny it, to insist his weary eyes had betrayed him, but the dust lay thick and real across the slate, smudged in a way that betrayed no trick of vision. Someone, something, had written back. Harlow's instinct was to call for the matron, to have another pair of eyes bear witness, but he stopped himself. The staff were already fraying, and such proof would either break them or drive them into hysteria. No, this was for him alone. The boy had chosen him, singled him out. If the whispers in his mind were real, if the messages on his desk and now this were connected, then he was no longer a doctor observing an orphan. He was a participant in a dialogue he had never consented to. The next morning, Harlow confronted the boy in the yard, where the others huddled apart. He spoke plainly, his tone stripped of pretense. "What do you want from me?" The boy's gaze did not waver, though he tilted his head slightly, as if tasting the question before discarding it. He turned away, walking to the fence line where shadows pooled, and touched the wood with one pale hand. On the ground at his feet, carved into the dirt by a stick, appeared two words: "Ask better." From then on, it became a game of questions. Harlow began to test the boy, not with childish queries, but with deliberate probes meant to expose whatever intelligence lay behind the silence. He asked about origins, about purpose, about why he refused to speak. Answers came sparingly, but they came. Chalked on doors, traced into frost on window panes, even once scratched into the condensation of Harlow's own spectacles when he left them on his desk overnight. Each message was brief, cryptic, but undeniably tied to his questions. And yet, the more he asked, the more he felt the balance shifting. It was not he conducting the experiment, but the boy. The responses were not answers. They were tests of his own persistence, his own willingness to accept the unnatural. He realized with growing dread that the boy was measuring him, probing the limits of his reason, the elasticity of his faith in the visible world. One evening, Harlow asked a question without words. He simply set his notebook open on the desk, its pages blank, and left the chalk beside it. In the morning, the page bore new writing in a hand identical to his own. "You belong to this now," it read. He burned that page in the stove, but the ashes refused to scatter, clinging in black fragments that seemed to spell out the same phrase, even as they curled into smoke. Harlow began to fear sleep, for when he closed his eyes, he dreamt not of the boy, but of himself as a boy, standing barefoot in unfamiliar halls, writing messages he did not remember, smiling with lips that were not his. He would wake with the taste of chalk at the back of his throat. The boundary between observer and subject was dissolving, and Harlow felt the walls of the orphanage pressing closer each day. The boy's silence was no longer emptiness, it was command. And in the stillness of his office, Harlow began to wonder if the orphan was not here to be understood at all, but to replace something that was already vanishing within him. The thought unsettled him more than any apparition. It was not merely that the boy had intruded upon his work, his notes, or his dreams. It was the suspicion that the child was eroding him, hollowing him out, and preparing to inhabit whatever space remained. That suspicion gnawed at Harlow's rational core, yet he could not dismiss it. Every hour spent in the orphanage made him less certain of where his own thoughts ended and the boy's began. In his unease, Harlow began to search for tangible evidence, something that might root his experiences in the physical world. Late one night, when the others slept, he moved through the corridors with a lantern and entered a storage room rarely used. Behind old trunks and warped furniture, he found a door half hidden by fallen plaster. It opened with effort, revealing a narrow staircase that descended beneath the orphanage. The air grew colder as he descended. Dust thickened, carrying the scent of damp earth. At the base of the stairs was a cramped chamber lined with crates and shelves. But it was not the storage itself that stilled Harlow's breath. It was the writing that covered the walls. Words scrawled in chalk, in charcoal, in soot. Phrases layered upon phrases until the stone was blackened with repetition. Not yours. You know me. Ask better. You are mine. The same sentences he had seen above, inscribed here as though rehearsed countless times. Harlow lifted the lantern higher and saw crude diagrams among the words, shapes resembling figures of children, their limbs elongated, their faces marked with blank ovals where features should be. Circles surrounded them, like cages or perhaps stages, and in the center of the far wall, pressed deep into the stone as if carved by more than human strength, was a single phrase repeated again and again: replace. He staggered back, the lantern nearly slipping from his grasp. This was no spontaneous defiance. This was systematic, deliberate. Someone had been building meaning here in secret, layering intent with each mark. And the handwriting, he recognized it. It was the same unsettling half-child, half-adult script that had appeared on the blackboard, his desk, his notebook. A sound drifted through the chamber, faint as a sigh. He turned sharply. At the top of the stairs stood the boy, framed in shadow. His small hand rested on the rail, but his posture was not that of a child caught wandering. It was that of a keeper watching his subject discover a truth too soon. Harlow's lantern flickered, and in that pulse of failing light, he saw the boy's lips part, not to speak, but to draw a breath as though preparing to release something that would extinguish what courage remained in him. The lantern died, and the chamber plunged into darkness. In that suffocating black, Harlow heard nothing, not footsteps, not breath, only the echo of a word that was not spoken aloud, but burned itself into his mind as if carved there forever. Replace. Only when he stumbled back into the corridor, gasping, did he realize the boy had not followed. He had remained below, standing calmly among the words, as if he belonged there and always had. And Harlow understood then that the orphanage was not merely housing a lost child. It was harboring something patient, something methodical, something that had been preparing far longer than anyone could grasp. He carried that realization like a hidden wound, raw and impossible to show. Yet when he tried to bring his discovery to the authorities, the result was silence as absolute as the boy's. The sheriff refused to hear him. The magistrate dismissed him outright, citing the stress of overwork. Even his colleagues in medicine waved away his letters. A child scribbling strange words in chalk was not grounds for alarm, they said. They reminded him that orphans often expressed their grief in troubling ways. But none of them had seen the chamber beneath the orphanage. None of them had read the walls. Harlow returned to the matron with his findings, determined to have her descend into that dark room. But when he spoke, her expression hardened. "There is no such place," she insisted. Her voice wavered, though her words struck like iron. "You will not take me down there." When pressed, she whispered a phrase that chilled him more than denial. "You think you found it, but it found you." After that, she refused to speak of it again. It was clear then that the orphanage itself was complicit, whether through fear, denial, or something far worse. The boy was not simply tolerated, he was protected by the very structure meant to contain him. One evening, while Harlow sat in the dining hall, among the restless children, the boy approached his table for the first time. He carried no tray, no food. He simply placed himself across from the doctor and rested his thin hands on the wood. The hall hushed instantly. Even the clatter of spoons stopped. The boy's silence was heavier than speech, and in that hush, Harlow felt words press into his thoughts, though the lips across from him never moved. Why fight it? He nearly recoiled, but forced himself to hold steady, gripping the edge of the table. His instinct as a physician was to reason, to catalog, to reduce this presence to ailment. But his instinct as a man told him something else entirely, that he was already being drawn into a current stronger than reason. He thought of the word etched into the wall below. Replace. "Why me?" he whispered, his voice so soft. The children nearest leaned forward, thinking he addressed them. The boy only tilted his head, a faint shadow of a smile appearing. In the grain of the table before Harlow, dust shifted as if disturbed by invisible breath. Letters formed slowly, like pale veins rising under skin. Because you look back, that night sleep abandoned him. He wandered the orphanage halls, convinced every door concealed eyes watching, waiting. When he finally collapsed at his desk, dawn seeping through the curtains, he woke to find his own hand smeared in chalk dust. though he had not touched chalk since the night in the classroom. On the page before him, written in his hand, yet foreign to his memory, were the words, "Closer now." And with that, Harlow realized he was no longer the boy's observer. He was becoming the experiment. The weight of that knowledge bore down on him like iron shackles. No matter how he tried to separate his mind from the boy's presence, there was a tightening, a slow weaving of threads that bound them together. It was no longer enough to watch him. Now Harlow felt himself being watched in return, not just with eyes, but with a force that reached into thought itself. The changes came subtly at first. His colleagues in town noticed he seemed distracted, his once neat handwriting devolving into erratic scrawls, as though two hands fought over the same pen. At meals in the orphanage, the children grew restless in his company, whispering that the doctor sometimes mouthed words when he thought no one was looking. Even the matron avoided his gaze, as if she too feared that whatever followed the boy had begun to settle into him. But the most dreadful sign came from his home. One morning, as Harlow reached for his coat, his wife handed him a scrap of paper she had found in their daughter's room. The girl, only 7, had scrawled the words "not yours" again and again across the page. When asked why, she said simply, "The quiet boy told me." She had never seen the orphan. She had never been near the orphanage. Harlow's chest tightened as if the air itself turned traitorous. The influence had reached beyond the walls. His family was no longer safe. That evening he sat across from his wife, who looked at him with the weary eyes of someone who knew more than she dared to speak. "You must end this," she whispered, "before it takes her." But how could he? The boy was no ordinary child, no patient to be treated, no criminal to be arrested. He was something that tested the edges of what belonged in this world. To remove him was not as simple as sending him away. It would mean confronting something that did not yield to the laws of men. Still, a resolve began to form in Harlow. He could not abandon his daughter to the same fate that now seemed to consume him. He would watch, yes, but more than that, he would intervene. He began to record meticulously not only the words and the appearances of chalk, but the times, the weather, the changes in the air. He was searching for a pattern, a weakness, some point where the boy's hold might falter. Days turned into weeks, and the boy seemed aware of this shift. Harlow often found him watching with faint amusement, as though indulging a game. One afternoon, in the dining hall, the boy walked past him, dragging a finger across the long wooden table. When he lifted his hand, the word remained etched faintly in the grain, though no chalk, no dust had touched it. Soon. The message was not only for Harlow, it was for all of them. Soon meant escalation. Soon meant the circle would widen, and no wall, no prayer, no denial would hold it back. Harlow lay awake that night, listening to his daughter breathe. Each small sound a reminder of what he stood to lose. He knew then that if he did not act, the boy's claim, "You are mine," would extend to all he loved. He began to plan. It was not the kind of plan that could be committed to paper, for Harlow no longer trusted even his own hands. Too often he woke to find his writing altered, the words twisting into sentences he did not remember composing. So the plan lived in his mind, alone, forming in silence, shielded even from himself until the moment of action. To understand his enemy, he first forced himself to look back at everything the boy had left behind. Every phrase, every carved word, every gesture. He reconstructed the timeline in his thoughts. The orphan's arrival in the spring, the first chalk message declaring he was a stranger, the words growing sharper, closer, until they no longer described separation, but possession. "Not yours. You know me. You are mine. Replace. Closer now. Soon." Each phrase was not random, but a progression, a sequence as deliberate as the stages of illness. The conclusion was dreadful in its simplicity. The boy's silence was not a void, but a method. He had been studying them, studying him, until the moment of replacement was ready. Harlow, trained in diagnosing fevers and fractures, began to see the orphanage not as a home, but as a laboratory. Each child and each adult a specimen under the boy's gaze. He forced himself to consider how the others had changed. The matron, once stern, was now gaunt and brittle, speaking less with each passing day. The reverend had stopped visiting altogether, retreating into sermons that spoke only of battles unseen. The sheriff, who had once scoffed, was said to have taken to drink heavily, his wife whispering that he muttered of children in the dark corners of their room. All who touched the boy's sphere seemed to unravel in some way, and now his daughter had written the words. That, above all, was the line he could not allow crossed. He imagined her small hand clutching chalk, her young eyes filling with knowledge too heavy to bear. Rage and dread coiled together in him, and he felt the moment had come. But the boy anticipated him. One afternoon, while Harlow sat at his desk, forcing his mind into clarity, the orphan appeared in the doorway. He did not enter, only stood there, his face in half shadow. For the first time, he broke the silence with action. In his hand, he held a torn scrap of Harlow's notebook. Upon it, in the doctor's own handwriting, were words that had not yet been written. "You will fail." The paper fell from the boy's fingers like a verdict. Harlow stared at it, pulse hammering, and knew then that his thoughts were no longer entirely his own. The boy had reached inside, found the plan before it had even been born, and pulled it into the world as proof of futility. Still, Harlow clenched his fists and swore he would not yield. If the boy believed he would fail, then failure itself must be tested. And so he resolved not to retreat, but to move closer, into the heart of whatever darkness the orphan carried, even if it consumed him. That night, he returned to the chamber beneath the orphanage with only a lantern and his resolve. What he found waiting in the shadows was not words, but something far worse. The chamber was no longer silent. The air thrummed faintly, like the hum of distant machinery, though Harlow knew no such device could exist beneath those bricks. His lantern light spilled across the walls, revealing that the words had multiplied since his last visit. They climbed the stone in frantic repetitions, circling and overlapping until the room seemed alive with text. Yet one phrase dominated them all, written larger, bolder, in strokes that looked gouged rather than drawn. "You are next." Harlow's throat constricted. He forced himself forward, holding the lantern higher. The crude figures he had once seen, the childlike shapes with hollow ovals for faces, had grown more defined. Now they bore features, and to his horror, the faces bore resemblance to the staff of the orphanage, to the reverend, even to the sheriff. And at the edge of the wall, smaller than the rest but unmistakable, was the outline of his own face, half finished, waiting to be completed. His lantern sputtered. A breath of air moved past him, though there was no window, no opening for wind. He turned, and there, in the corner, the boy stood. But something was different. He did not watch with passive calm. His eyes gleamed with intent, as if the silent game was over and the lesson was ready to begin. Harlow lifted the lantern like a shield. "What are you?" he demanded, his voice breaking. The boy took a step forward, not with menace, but with inevitability, as if answering the question through motion alone. The hum in the air deepened, resonating now in Harlow's chest, vibrating his ribs until he felt as though his very bones were tuning to some alien chord. Then came the whisper, not in his ears but inside his skull, heavy and undeniable. "I am what you fear when you look too long. I am what comes to replace." Harlow staggered back, pressing his palms to his temples. He wanted to deny the voice, but the words seemed to unspool from his own thoughts, indistinguishable from himself. The boy was not speaking to him, he was speaking as him. The boundary between them had thinned to nothing. He fled the chamber, lantern swaying wildly, and stumbled into the upper halls where the children slept. Yet when he looked at their faces, he saw not innocence, but expectation, as though they too awaited the conclusion of some experiment. His knees buckled under the weight of dread. From that night onward, Harlow could not escape the sense that the boy had turned his attention fully upon him. He found messages not just at the orphanage, but in his own home. Scratched faintly into the wood of his daughter's door, "She is mine if you falter," written in steam upon his bathroom mirror, "Choose." The realization struck with cruel clarity. He was no longer the observer. He was the subject. The boy's silence had shifted its focus entirely onto him, drawing him into the final stage of whatever design had been building since the day the child arrived in Pikeville. Harlow understood he could not delay. If he did not confront the boy directly, the threat would consume not only himself, but his family. Yet to confront him meant surrendering to the very trap the orphan had been tightening all along. Still, with his hands trembling and his breath shallow, Harlow resolved that the next encounter would not end with silence. The moment came sooner than he expected. On a night when the moon sat low and red over Pikeville, the orphanage lay cloaked in uneasy stillness. The children, restless from fevered dreams, whispered among themselves in their dormitories, while the matron paced the halls with a candle that seemed to shrink rather than banish the dark. Harlow, however, did not wait for the boy to find him. He went searching. He found him in the dining hall, seated at the long table, as if waiting. No food before him, no lantern lit, only the pale gleam of moonlight cutting across his small form. The boy's eyes lifted when Harlow entered, steady, unblinking, filled with an understanding that made the doctor's stomach tighten. This was no child caught off guard. It was a meeting arranged long before Harlow admitted it. "I will not let you take them," Harlow said, his voice hoarse but firm. "Not my daughter, not these children, not me." The boy did not answer aloud, but the reply filled the silence all the same. "You are already mine." Harlow advanced, forcing himself closer, though every nerve screamed to turn and flee. He slammed his palm on the table, the sound cracking like a shot in the still room. "Speak," he demanded. "If you mean to claim me, then let me hear your voice." The boy's lips parted. For a moment, the air itself seemed to wait, thick and suspended. Then a sound escaped, not words, but a low vibration, a resonance that rattled the windows and sent crockery tumbling from the shelves. Harlow clutched his ears, yet the sound was not in his ears at all. It was inside his skull, swelling until his thoughts were drowned. He staggered but forced himself upright, reaching for the crucifix that hung at his neck. "In God's name, leave me!" he shouted. The boy's eyes glimmered and the sound deepened until the wood of the table split with a groan. Shadows writhed along the walls, stretching into shapes of children faceless and tall, their hands outstretched. The matron burst into the room then, candles sputtering, and froze at the sight. Behind her came two attendants, drawn by the noise. Their presence fractured the moment and the shadows shivered like smoke. The boy turned his gaze from Harlow to the others, and in that instant the oppressive hum ceased. The silence that followed was suffocating. The attendants dragged Harlow back, his body trembling, his breath ragged. The matron clutched her cross, her lips moving soundlessly. The boy remained seated, his expression unreadable, as if nothing had happened. But Harlow knew differently. The boy had revealed his strength, not fully, but enough, and he had made his point. He could shake walls, bend thought, and summon fear with a whisper. Yet he had chosen not to end it. He had chosen to wait. Later that night, as Harlow lay in his bed at home, his daughter stirred in her sleep and whispered something that froze his blood. He leaned close, dreading the confirmation, and heard her murmur with perfect calm, "I belong to him now." The words were soft, dreamlike, yet they carried a finality that hollowed him out. He pressed a trembling hand to her brow, desperate to believe it was the fever speaking, a fragment of overheard whispers stitched into a child's dream. But the cadence, the certainty mirrored too perfectly the silence that clung to the orphan. It was not a child's delirium. It was possession of a different kind. By morning, his wife confronted him with fear in her eyes. "You've brought him into this house," she said. "Even if his body lies in that orphanage, he is here now." She demanded he cut all ties, but Harlow knew it was too late for such distance. The boy was not bound by walls. Separation was an illusion. Within days, townsfolk intervened. Harlow's increasing agitation, his sleepless eyes, and the whispered rumors of his obsession forced the magistrate to act. A quiet order was given. The boy would be transferred to a state institution far from Pikeville. The matron wept with relief. The attendants crossed themselves, and the reverend called it providence. Yet Harlow knew it was no victory. The morning of the transfer was heavy with rain. 2 men arrived with a carriage and restraints. Though the boy offered no resistance, he walked between them calmly, his gaze steady, as if indulging them in a ritual whose outcome he already knew. The children lined the hallway silent, watching him pass with a reverence closer to fear than grief. When he reached the threshold, he paused, his eyes lifted, finding Harlow among the onlookers. For the first time, his lips moved in a shape unmistakable, a smile both tender and cruel. No words emerged, yet in Harlow's mind, the voice resounded, "Walls do not hold me. You know this." The carriage rattled away, leaving the orphanage hollow in his absence. The staff spoke of peace returning, yet the atmosphere was not relief, but suspension, as if breath was being held until the inevitable return. At the institution, reports trickled back. The boy behaved with impeccable calm, answering none of the doctors but fixing them with such steady attention that seasoned physicians found excuses to avoid him. He would sit in the corner of rooms, head tilted, as though listening to a language none of them could hear. The first attendant assigned to him resigned within a week, claiming that silence itself had begun to follow him home. Harlow was granted a visit. He found the boy in a cell furnished only with a cot and a table. The child looked thinner, but his presence filled the space utterly. When Harlow entered, he feigned frailty, lowering his eyes, his lips trembling as if with withheld tears. To the other doctors, he appeared pitiful, a damaged child whose silence was sorrow. But Harlow knew better. The performance was meant for them, not for him. When their backs turned, the boy's eyes met his, sharp and gleaming with mockery. And in that instant, Harlow understood that the orphan had not been removed from Pikeville at all. He had expanded his reach. The institution was built of gray stone, its corridors long and echoing, its barred windows thick with dust from years of confinement. Here, men and women muttered to themselves in cells, their voices blending into a ceaseless murmur of fractured thoughts. Yet amid the chaos, the orphan remained composed, his silence more commanding than the loudest shrieks. He was not absorbed into the place, he altered it. Within weeks of his arrival, incidents began. A nurse dropped boiling water upon herself, insisting later that she had felt compelled to pour. A patient who had not spoken in years suddenly screamed one phrase endlessly, "Not yours." The head physician collapsed at his desk from a seizure, surviving only to say with broken lips that he had seen a child standing in his office, though no one had been there. Harlow followed these reports with a mixture of horror and grim recognition. The boy had not diminished in isolation. He had thrived, adapting to new ground as though the institution itself were soil for him to root deeper. When Harlow visited again, he noticed a change. The boy now carried himself with faint mimicry of sorrow, drooping shoulders, downcast eyes. Yet behind it, shimmered calculation. He had learned to play frailty, to disarm those who measured him. Harlow lingered after the others left. Alone, he approached the table where the boy sat, a thin journal resting before him. Its pages were filled not with drawings or childish scrawl, but with ordered symbols, lines, circles, shapes, intersecting in coded progression. Harlow leafed through it, pulse quickening, realizing the patterns echoed the diagrams he had seen carved into the walls beneath the orphanage. This was no idle doodling. It was record and design, the work of something far older than the hand that held the pencil. "Where does this lead?" Harlow whispered, though he expected no answer. The boy raised his eyes. For the briefest moment, his lips parted. A sound emerged, soft, almost tender, yet what reached Harlow's mind was a single word, with the weight of a verdict. Further, that night, another nurse was found unconscious, her wrists bruised as though she had fought invisible hands. A patient tore at the plaster walls, insisting that words were written behind them. When the staff pried the plaster open, they discovered faint traces of chalk embedded deep in the stone. Whispers spread among the workers. Some refused to enter the boy's ward after dark. Others crossed themselves whenever his gaze met theirs. But dismissal was impossible. He was not violent. He broke no rules. He only was, and that being spread like a stain. Harlow returned once more, driven not by duty but by something darker, an obsession that gnawed at him with the same hunger the boy displayed. In the journal's newest pages, he found words written in his own handwriting, though he had never touched the pencil. "You are closer now. Soon you will see." And Harlow realized the institution was not a prison for the boy. It was a theater, and the true performance had only begun. The weeks that followed confirmed it. The boy no longer needed to scrawl his phrases in chalk or carve them into wood. They appeared in subtler ways now, embedded in the pauses of doctors' speech, whispered by patients who had never seen him, traced in condensation upon windows no one had touched. The building itself seemed to pulse with his presence, each corridor bending toward his silent command. Then, without warning, he was gone. One morning, the guards unlocked his door and found the cot empty, the sheets undisturbed, no sign of struggle or escape. The barred window was intact, the locks unbroken. The journal lay open on the table, its final page filled with a single phrase repeated over and over: "I belong everywhere." Panic swept the institution. Search parties scoured the grounds, lanterns bobbing through rain-drenched fields. They found nothing. Days passed, then weeks, and the official record closed with the conclusion no one believed. The boy had vanished. Vanished as if he had never been. But Pikeville knew better. The matron died within a month, her final words a delirious plea not to let the children near the walls at night. The sheriff was found wandering the roads barefoot, muttering that the boy had passed through his home, leaving his wife in silence so deep she never spoke again. The reverend abandoned his pulpit entirely, claiming his prayers only fed the presence that listened behind every word. And Harlow, he carried the weight of knowledge heavier than any of them. His daughter no longer dreamed as other children did. She awoke with chalk dust on her fingers, her small hands stained as if she had been writing in her sleep. When he tried to question her, she only smiled with that same slow, deliberate calm that had first unmade him in the orphanage halls. He kept the journal hidden, its coded diagrams etched into his mind. He read them by lamplight, though each time he did, he felt the boy closer, as if leaning over his shoulder. The final pages were the worst. They bore no symbols, only sentences written in Harlow's own hand. "You have replaced yourself already." He knew then that escape was impossible. The boy had not disappeared, he had dispersed. Whatever he was had seeped into the town, the families, the very language of those who dared to speak of him. He was not gone, only multiplied. In the years that followed, whispers lingered in Pikeville. Children who never met the orphan still scrawled the same words on their slates. Strangers passing through felt the gaze of eyes that were not there. Some left quickly, unwilling to stay. Others stayed too long and changed in ways that could not be named. As for Harlow, his journals were found decades later, pages brittle with age, filled with the steady descent of a man who had seen too much. The last entry bore only a single line, written with deliberate care. He does not need a voice because he is ours now. And perhaps that is the truest horror, that silence itself can claim possession, spreading not through sound but through the spaces where words should be.